A lonely CEO agrees to a blind date and falls for a poor girl. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and comment where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. The phone buzzed for the 6th time on the dark walnut desk before Ethan Carver finally tore his eyes away from the quarterly merger report. The name flashing on the screen was one he knew all too well: Jack Monroe. He exhaled through his nose, picked up the phone with a flat expression, and answered without much enthusiasm. "This better be important," he said, his voice firm as he turned his gaze back to the skyline stretching beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Preston Tower in downtown Seattle. Up there, 35 stories above the noise, he rang Carver Innovations, one of the leading clean energy firms in North America, overseeing every acquisition and initiative that kept the company at the top. From this vantage point, the world below seemed distant, and that was exactly how Ethan preferred it. "Ethan, my man, I swear, this one's quick," Jack said on the other end, his voice carrying the usual undertone of mischief. Ethan leaned back in his chair and rubbed his temple, already regretting the call. They'd been friends since boarding school in Vermont, though their lives had taken drastically different turns. While Ethan built his empire brick by brick, sacrificing sleep and relationships along the way, Jack floated through life with charm and luck. "If this is about money, you know my assistant's number." "Nope, not about money. I actually need a personal favor." That alone made Ethan pause. "You remember Julia Kramer? The architect I met at that gala last fall. She wants to bring her roommate to dinner tonight, and I may have promised I'd bring someone too." No, the word came immediately. Clipped and final. "Find someone else." "Come on, man. Everyone else is either married or out of town. It's just dinner. I really like this girl." Ethan glanced back at his screen, where the final phase of the Cleotech merger, 3 years in the making, stared back at him. The deal was one signature away from transforming Carver Innovations into the dominant force in sustainable storage across the continent. "I'm busy, Jack. You're always busy. Name one time you've done something not tied to work." Ethan didn't respond. "Since Christina, you don't say her name." His tone dropped like a hammer, slicing clean through the call. There was a pause on the other end. Then, Jack's voice returned, softer. "Just this once. I promise, no more favors." Ethan didn't believe that for a second. Jack always had a next thing, but maybe a few hours outside the tower would give his brain some clarity. "Send me the details. You're a hero, and wear something normal. Also, try smiling." Ethan hung up and placed the phone aside. The city outside was awash in winter blue as daylight dimmed over Elliott Bay. Office lights blinked on across buildings. He watched people below, blurred dots on sidewalks, wrapped in coats and rushing toward whatever their night held. He used to be one of them, young, hopeful, believing in things like love, possibility, connection. All of that had cracked the day Christina walked out without a goodbye, taking with her every reason he once had to let someone in again. He didn't speak of it. He didn't need to. The void she left had done the talking for years. Later that evening, his driver pulled up to Vespera, a low-lit brasserie tucked in a quieter corner of Belltown. It was elegant without being flashy, the kind of place where local politicians, artists, and tech elites cross paths without fanfare. Warm light spilled onto the wet pavement, and the windows fogged slightly from the temperature shift. Snow had begun to fall, a soft dusting that coated the sidewalk in a shimmer. "Stay close, Martin. I won't be long," Ethan said as he stepped out, adjusting the cuff of his coat. He was halfway to the entrance when a voice stopped him. "I gave you a 20. The ride was 12. A woman was saying to a cab driver parked at the corner. She wasn't shouting, just speaking. Fast, with urgency, rather than anger. "You handed me a 5, the driver replied, clearly tired of the argument. "It was my last 20. "Please, I need that change," she said, shivering under a worn coat, one hand gripping her bag as she tried to reason with him. Ethan moved instinctively. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his tone even but authoritative enough to draw both of their attention. The woman turned, and something about the moment caught him off guard, like the street noise faded all at once. Her eyes were amber, bright and alert despite the cold, framed by dark lashes flecked with snow. Her hair, a soft chestnut brown, fell in gentle waves, and her expression wasn't bitter, just embarrassed. Her coat had seen better winters, and yet she stood with a dignity that made her look striking despite the circumstances. "This doesn't concern you, sir," the cabbie said, already annoyed. Ethan ignored him, pulling out his wallet and handing over a $50 bill. "Keep the change." The man took the money and drove off without another word. "You didn't have to do that." "But thank you," she said, clutching her purse closer. "I'll find a way to pay you back. Don't worry about it." Ethan studied her, unsure why he hadn't already walked inside. Something about her presence was disarming. She didn't carry herself like someone trying to impress anyone. "Sophie Garner," she said, offering a gloved hand. "Ethan Carver." He took her hand, feeling an unexpected warmth spread through his arm. "Well, Ethan Carver, I guess I owe you $38 now," she added with a crooked smile, and 2 dimples that appeared like punctuation marks on either cheek. "You here for dinner?" he asked, tilting his head toward the entrance. She hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, blind date. My roommate insisted I start saying yes to possibilities." He raised an eyebrow. "Your roommate wouldn't happen to be Julia, would she?" Her eyes widened. "Yes. How do you know that?" Ethan's phone buzzed again. A message from Jack. "Running late. Just hang in there. I owe you." He looked back at Sophie, and in that moment, everything clicked. This wasn't just any dinner. She was the blind date Jack had roped him into, but nothing about her fit what he'd expected. And that, more than anything, was exactly why he couldn't look away. Ethan pushed open the door to the Copper Ivy, stepping into the warm, elegant glow of the restaurant. The contrast with the sharp cold outside was immediate and welcome. Inside, soft lighting bathed the room in amber tones, with mellow jazz playing. Low and tables arranged with precise care. A Materdi greeted him by name and led him toward a reserved corner table near the window, from where the faint snowfall over downtown Seattle could still be seen. Before sitting, Ethan glanced back. Sophie Garner followed him a few steps behind, taking in the space with a kind of quiet wonder, as if uncertain whether she truly belonged there. Her gaze moved across the room, cautious but curious. It was clear she wasn't used to places like this, and she didn't bother hiding it. "I've passed by this place so many times. Always wondered what it looked like inside," she said softly, as if speaking too loudly might draw attention. Ethan pulled out her chair and noticed the frayed edges of her coat sleeves just before she slipped it off. Beneath it, she wore a navy blue dress. Simple, modest, but it moved with a grace that matched her. He ordered a bottle of red without even glancing at the wine list, and the sommelier nodded in approval, clearly familiar with the choice. "Jack and Julia are running late," Ethan commented, settling into his seat. "Typical. Those two operate in their own time zone. We call it Julia's Standard Time at home," Sophie joked, a real smile blooming on her face. "Always 30 minutes behind the rest of the world. Jack's the same. I have to trick him with fake start times if I want him to show up anywhere close to punctual," Ethan replied, chuckling. The exchange felt easy, unforced, a rhythm already forming between them. They seemed to know each other well, she said after a moment. I wonder what they saw in us that made them think this would be a good idea. Her tone was light, more curious than critical. Before either of them could say more, the sommelier returned with the wine. Ethan tasted it first, then poured for both. Sophie took a small sip and closed her eyes briefly, as though letting the flavor unfold completely. It's amazing. I should warn you though, my wine expertise maxes out at red or white, and only if it's on sale. Ethan laughed, more than he had in days. You wouldn't believe how refreshing that is. Everyone's a wine expert these days. Julia says I'm brutally honest. It's apparently a character flaw, Sophie said, turning the glass by its stem. She's been trying to upgrade me since college. Thinks I should aim higher. And what do you think? Ethan leaned in a little, genuinely curious. I think happiness isn't about aiming higher. It's about finding meaning. I love teaching. Seeing a kid finally sound out a full sentence? That's magic. Maybe it's not glamorous, but it matters to me. He studied her carefully. No performance. No agenda. Just truth, laid bare. It was disarming in a way he wasn't used to. In his world of polished pitches and guarded intentions, someone like her felt like a rare anomaly. That's admirable. He said quietly, to feel that kind of purpose in what you do. What about you? She asked. Do you find purpose in your work, or is it all just about the bottom line? It caught him off guard. Women he met usually asked about his travels, his cars, or his business milestones, never about the meaning behind it all. Preston & Locke employs over 50,000 people. The decisions I make affect families. That ... carries weight. That's the CEO answer, she teased, tilting her head. I asked about Ethan. Before he could say more, his phone buzzed. A message from Jack. Julia's sister had a fashion emergency. We're out. Enjoy the night. My treat. You'll thank me later. Ethan looked up, and Sophie had already checked her phone too. Their eyes met. Let me guess, he said. They're not coming. She nodded, the blush rising to her cheeks. Apparently, Julia had to handle a crisis involving her sister's missing shoes. Ethan leaned back, sighing. They set us up. Sophie reached for her napkin. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to waste your time. This clearly wasn't what you signed up for. Wait, he said, surprising even himself. We're already here. The wine's good. Seems like a shame to waste the reservation. She hesitated. Then, after a second, sat back down. You sure? We don't exactly. Seemed ... compatible. The word lingered between them. Ethan didn't answer right away. He looked at her again. The simple dress, the open expression, the lack of any filter. The women who usually sat across from him wore designer heels and perfect lipstick. They were always prepared, always polished. And yet here she was, unguarded and real. Maybe that's exactly why we should keep having this dinner. The food arrived. His butter-poached sea urchin with champagne caviar. Hers, a mixed green salad with black truffle vinaigrette, the safest choice she'd found on the menu. He watched her try the first bite and saw her eyes brighten with surprise. No pretense, just genuine delight. Tell me about your family, she said, shifting the subject easily. Ethan's jaw tightened. Not much to tell. My parents died in a plane crash when I was 12. I was raised by my grandfather. He taught me business. Not much else. I'm sorry, Sophie replied, her hand almost reaching across the table before stopping mid-gesture. That must have been hard. It was a long time ago, he said, brushing it off. And yours? He asked. She relaxed a bit. My dad's a mechanic in Walla Walla. My mom's a nurse. They've been together 35 years and still hold hands when they walk. My younger brother just became a firefighter. We're not fancy, but we have what counts. Something inside Ethan stirred. Not jealousy, exactly. Maybe envy. They sound amazing. They are, she said with quiet pride. They just worry about me living alone in the city. My dad calls every Sunday to remind me to lock my doors and avoid weird strangers. She laughed. He'd totally freak if he knew I was having dinner with a billionaire who stepped in during a cab fight. Billionaire? Ethan raised an eyebrow. You Googled me? Julia sent me a whole profile summary right before I got in the cab. That was the first word. She doesn't play around when she's in matchmaking mode. He chuckled, then felt a twinge of curiosity. And what else did this summary say? That you're brilliant but intense. That you used to date a model named Christina. And that ... since her ... She trailed off. Since her, he prompted. Since her, you've been emotionally unavailable. She finished gently. Her words, not mine. He stared down at his glass for a moment. Your friend's pretty thorough. But if it means anything, Sophie added softly, whoever hurt you made a massive mistake. He looked away. Her voice didn't just echo in his ears. It hit somewhere deeper. Trying to shake the moment off, he asked, we've talked a lot about me. That's not fair. Tell me something I wouldn't find in a background check on you. Ethan leaned back in his chair, watching Sophie with a kind of attention that had shifted from polite to personal. The question he had just asked, tell me something about you I wouldn't find in a background check, lingered between them, not as a challenge, but an invitation. She paused for a few seconds before answering. I collect vintage children's books, she said, turning her wine glass slowly between her fingers. I have shelves full of them in my apartment. Most are worn, a little yellowed, but they all mean something to me. I think there's more wisdom in a single Winnie the Pooh quote than in 100 motivational speeches. Ethan raised an eyebrow, intrigued. You're saying a stuffed bear knows more about life than seasoned CEOs? Absolutely, she replied with a smile that held nothing but conviction. Like, sometimes the smallest things take up the most room in your heart. That line alone is worth an MBA. Their entrees arrived just as the moment softened. Ethan had ordered lobster with citrus butter and saffron risotto. Sophie had gone with the roasted thyme chicken and rustic vegetables, a recommendation from the chef that she accepted out of curiosity. She took her first bite and her eyes widened in surprise. This is incredible. Ethan's voice lowered a little. I'm glad you came, even if it wasn't really planned. It's definitely not the kind of place I'm used to, she admitted, setting her fork down between bites. On the way over, I almost told the cab to turn around 3 times. But something made me stay. She didn't explain what that something was, but the look she gave him said enough. As dinner went on, Sophie talked about her students in a way that tugged at something buried deep in Ethan. Something he thought had closed off long ago. She shared their stories, small triumphs, silly drawings left on her desk. Even a little girl who hadn't spoken a word for months until one day, reading a book about cats, she whispered her first one. There was such sincerity in her voice, such raw belief in the power of what she did, that Ethan found himself listening with a focus he didn't often give anyone. She wasn't trying to impress him. She was simply being in return. He opened up more than usual. He talked about his love for vintage cars, something he rarely brought up. It was a passion inherited from his father, even though they'd barely known each other. He owned a modest garage outside the city where he kept 3 old models he was restoring slowly, one bolt at a time. Then he admitted almost sheepishly that he read poetry when he couldn't sleep. My grandfather would have hated that, he said. He'd believe sensitivity was a weakness. Did you believe him? She asked. For a long time, yeah. But you still read. Haven't stopped. She didn't say anything. Alce just smiled. A small, quiet smile that meant more than any reply. Time slipped away unnoticed. The plates were cleared, the wine refilled. When the waiter came back with the dessert menu, Ethan suggested the restaurant's signature, deconstructed key lime pie. "It looks like modern art on a plate," he explained, "but it tastes like childhood." Sophie agreed, curious. When the dish arrived, shards of crisp pastry, velvety citrus cream, scorched meringue, and candied zest, she took one spoonful and closed her eyes. "You were right. This is memory in sugar form." Ethan laughed, a sound that felt intimate and unguarded. Outside, snow still fell in soft layers, blanketing the streets and muting the usual noise of the city. Ethan's driver was already waiting, but he paused before getting in. "Let me take you home," he offered. "You said ... Washington Heights?" Sophie looked up, surprised. "Close. The Seattle version is more like North 87th. Quiet little street near Greenwood." "That's on my way." "It's not," she said, the corner of her mouth twitching. "But thanks." He didn't argue. "I'll take you anyway." He signaled to the driver, who opened the door without question. As the car glided through the snow-covered streets, Sophie traced the edge of the leather seat with her fingertip. "This car probably costs more than my school's annual supply." "Budget," she said, not judging, just stating a fact. "Maybe 2 years," Ethan replied with honesty. "But you never seemed impressed." "Because I'm not," she said calmly. "I'm far more moved by simple kindness than big numbers." "And today," she looked out the window, "today you were kind." The car slowed in front of a modest 4-story building with a warm facade and empty flower boxes frozen by the season. Ethan got out with her. The driver didn't move, only watching from his seat. "You don't have to walk me up," Sophie said, her voice neutral. "I know." Yet he stepped into the small lobby anyway. The elevator creaked open, and they rode up together in silence. On the 5th floor, she pulled a key from her coat pocket. "This is me." She turned to him, hand on the doorknob. "Thank you for tonight. It was more than I expected." Ethan could have just said good night, smiled, walked away. But something rooted him to the spot. "Can we do this again?" he asked. "No setups, no favors." She hesitated. Her expression was open but cautious. "Are you sure? We're not from the same world, Ethan." "Maybe that's the point." He lifted his hand without thinking and brushed a flake of snow from her hair. "You make me want to understand a different one." Sophie took a slow breath. "I'm not a fantasy. I'm not an escape. I know that." And when he spoke, there was nothing guarded in his voice, only truth. The snow had stopped sometime after midnight, but Seattle still lay beneath a soft white layer that shimmered under the first light of day. Ethan Carver, however, barely noticed the scenery as he stepped out of his penthouse that morning. He entered the back seat of his car with his gaze unfocused, his thoughts far removed from the agenda Margot had already sent to his phone. The previous night wouldn't leave his mind. Sophie, their conversations over dinner, the quiet ride in the elevator, the snowflake he brushed from her hair, and the way she looked at him before stepping into her apartment, unhurried, unafraid, as if silently saying, "It's your call if you come back." At the Carver Tower downtown, the headquarters of his green tech company, Ethan walked through the lobby with his usual determined pace, eyes forward, no unnecessary stops. But something felt different. The greetings from employees sounded a little warmer. Or maybe he was simply more aware. He headed straight to the executive meeting room, where his team waited to finalize the merger details with Solaritech. Charts glowed on the screen, accompanied by polished bullet points and data analysis, but Ethan barely followed. Next to his strategic notes, he found himself absent-mindedly sketching small bears and stacks of books. It wasn't until the general counsel announced a 15-minute break that he sat up, suddenly present. He gave a brief nod in agreement. Back in his office, Margot waited by the door with a hesitant expression. Mr. Carver, the Whitmore Foundation reached out again regarding tomorrow's charity event. They're asking if you might reconsider attending. Ethan typically declined such invitations. He preferred to donate quietly, without the spotlight. But something about the cause made him pause. Remind me... What's the focus again? Literacy programs in underfunded public schools. He didn't answer right away. His gaze drifted past the windows. Books, children, education. Sophie's voice echoed. In his mind, I collect vintage children's books. He finally turned to Margot. Can you check if North Maple Elementary in Walla Walla is one of their supported schools? She blinked, surprised by the mention of a small town. Of course. I'll find out. That evening, after rescheduling 2 meetings and ending a video call with a Japanese partner earlier than usual, Ethan headed home. The city glowed beneath the window of his penthouse, but instead of watching the view, he pulled out his phone and scrolled to the number Sophie had written on a folded napkin the night before. He stared at it for a few seconds before dialing. Hello? Her voice came through, cautious but calm. It's me, Ethan. Oh. A pause, then her tone shifted. Is everything all right? Yes, I hope this isn't intrusive. Just unexpected, she said, softer now. Honestly, I thought I dreamed the whole night. You didn't. It was real. The pause that followed was quieter, warmer. So, why are you calling? There's a charity gala tomorrow night. It's for children's literacy. I thought maybe you'd want to come with me. On the other end, he heard the sound of papers being shuffled. A gala? As in, gowns and tuxedos? Yes, it's at the Fairmont Olympic. Very formal, but meaningful. I don't exactly own anything appropriate. I can arrange something. No, thank you. If I go, I'll wear what I have. He smiled, knowing she meant it. Then I'll pick you up at 7? A soft exhale came through the line. All right, but on one condition. What is it? No posturing. No inaccessible CEO act. I want the guy from last night. You got it. The next morning, while Margot confirmed media coverage and high-profile guests for the event, Ethan focused on the essentials. No extravagance, no headlines, just precision. He quietly verified that Sophie's old school in Walla Walla was indeed among the programs the foundation supported. Then, he asked the organizing team if there would be any public recognition connected to it. He didn't want surprises, but he also wouldn't pull focus if Sophie happened to be honored. Finally, he informed his driver, Marcus, that their first stop would be a residential street in Greenwood. At exactly 7 p.m. The car eased up to a quiet block lined with modest buildings. When Sophie emerged from the entrance, Ethan had to stop himself from staring. Her black dress was simple, with no shimmer or label, but it fit her perfectly. Her hair was tied up neatly, a small pair of earrings catching the last of the daylight. Nothing flashy, and somehow that made her even more striking. He stepped out and opened the car door for her. You look stunning, and you seem a little more human than last night, she teased as she stepped in. Maybe education really is working. Or maybe it's the company. On the way to the hotel, their conversation flowed effortlessly. But as they pulled up to the grand entrance, Sophie froze slightly at the sight of the marble steps, the flashing cameras, the polished guests. They're all staring. They always are, Ethan said, offering his arm. But tonight, I only see you. She held his gaze for a moment, then took his arm, and together, they walked up the steps. Inside the ballroom, a space filled with glittering lights, floral arrangements, and priceless art. Sophie stood out, not for what she lacked, but for what she brought: sincerity. While others floated from group to group with practiced lines and crystal flutes, she spoke genuinely. She chatted with a school principal about book access, asked a publisher about affordable print runs, and gently challenged a senator's wife on the role of emotional support in early learning. Ethan stood close enough to listen, not to intervene, just watching her with a growing sense of something unfamiliar. It wasn't pride. It was admiration. And then, slicing through the low hum of music and voices, came a greeting he hadn't expected. "Good evening, Ethan." He turned around, and there she was, Christina, impeccable as always, but with something in her eyes he hadn't seen in a long time: urgency. The voice Ethan heard in the middle of the ballroom wasn't just a greeting, it was a memory. It felt like an echo from a part of his life he had long since closed off. When he turned around, he already knew. Christina was there. The same perfectly curated look, the same confident stride, the same deliberate tone. But something had shifted. Her posture was too tense. Her eyes, though steady, carried a restlessness that didn't match her usual poise. She seemed to be seeking more than a polite encounter. "You're doing well?" she asked, trying to sound casual, like they were just old acquaintances bumping into each other. "I am," Ethan answered flatly, cool and composed as ever. "And you?" "I got back to Seattle yesterday. Figured we might run into each other. I still move in familiar circles. You know how it is." "I do." His gaze didn't waver, but there was no warmth. He wanted to end the exchange as quickly as it had begun. That was when Sophie approached. She had seen the interaction from a distance and made her way over with calm steps, her expression neutral but observant. Ethan turned to her immediately. "Sophie, this is Christina." Sophie offered her hand with a quiet, poised gesture. "Nice to meet you." Christina took just a fraction longer than necessary to respond. And when she did, it wasn't with words, it was with a glance. Her eyes swept quickly over Sophie's simple black dress, her neatly tied hair, her lack of jewelry. Then she looked back at Ethan. "You've changed." "Yes," he said firmly. "She teaches at a public school. She works with kids who truly need someone to care. There are no cameras there, but she actually makes a difference." Christina gave a tight, ironic smile. A regular woman. After all those years surrounded by models and corporate elites, you decided to go for the opposite end of the spectrum. "No, I decided to look for someone real." Her smile didn't waver, but something behind it seemed to falter. "I just hope you know what you're doing." For the first time, I do. Sophie didn't speak right away. But the look she gave Ethan once Christina walked away was clear, an unspoken question in her eyes. He held her gaze, fully aware of everything that brief encounter had stirred. "Are you all right?" she asked quietly. "I am, but I'm not sure if you are." He took a moment. Seeing her didn't shake me the way I expected. It brought back memories, yes, but mostly it reminded me how far I've come. It felt like revisiting a place you no longer belong to. She nodded, glancing toward the far end of the room. Sometimes it takes a confrontation to realize what we've outgrown. Exactly. He reached for her hand under the table. And tonight, for the first time, I realized the past isn't the only thing that feels far away. The present is finally what matters most. Before Sophie could reply, the Foundation's director stepped onto the stage to begin the formal acknowledgments. The music faded, the waitstaff paused their service, and all attention turned to the front of the room. Ethan and Sophie sat near the stage. The director thanked donors, spoke about the Foundation's impact, and introduced the short video. As the lights dimmed and the screen lit up, Ethan felt Sophie stiffen beside him almost instantly. He recognized the setting immediately, the colorful drawings on the walls, the small desks, the bright, focused faces of children. It was her classroom. And then there she was, Sophie, standing before the class, animated and expressive, holding up a book. giving life to the story with changing voices and vivid gestures. The camera hadn't just captured a scene. It had captured the essence of what she did. When the video ended, the director returned to the microphone. "Now, I'd like to invite to the stage the teacher behind this extraordinary work, Ms. Sophie Garner." Applause filled the room. Sophie looked at Ethan, visibly surprised and a little overwhelmed. "No one told me about this." "Then take it as a sincere tribute," he said softly. "You deserve it." She hesitated, but the applause didn't stop. Slowly, she rose and walked to the stage with careful steps. When she reached the microphone, she stood still for a few seconds, visibly uncertain. But then her eyes found Ethan's in the crowd, and something inside her settled. "Good evening," she began. "Forgive the lack of polish. I didn't know I'd be speaking tonight, but maybe that's fitting. Because what we do every day in the classroom doesn't come with a script either." She spoke of the challenges, the shortage of books, the difficult conditions, but also of the victories. The first correctly written name, the moment a child reads without realizing they're reading. Her voice was steady, yet full of restrained emotion. When she finished, the silence lasted a second too long before erupting into a wave of applause. Back at the table, Sophie was greeted with sincere praise and admiration from people unaccustomed to stepping outside their rehearsed soundbites. Editors, school administrators, even business leaders approached to thank her. Ethan watched her, more impressed than ever by how she handled them, with patience but no flattery, keeping the focus where it belonged, on the children. When the event ended and they stepped outside, the car was already waiting. But Ethan looked up at the clear sky, the city glowing after the snow, and asked, "Want to walk for a bit?" "I think I do." They strolled through quieter streets with no particular direction. For a while, they didn't speak. But it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind of stillness where presence alone was enough. They paused near a small park where bare tree branches shimmered under the golden light of old street lamps. "Did she rattle you?" Sophie asked plainly. "Christina?" He thought for a second. "She made me realize I'm not who I used to be. And that what matters now isn't what ended, but what could begin." She turned toward him. "And do you know what you want to begin?" He reached for her hand, gently. "I'm still learning, but I genuinely want to try." This time, she didn't answer with words. She simply stood there, letting the gestures speak for them both. By the following Monday, after the Foundation's gala, everything at Carver Holdings had returned to its usual pace back-to-back meetings, high-stakes reports, and decisions that directly affected multi-million-dollar partnerships. But Ethan felt different. He was in the same glass and steel office, surrounded by the same numbers and power plays, yet something inside him had shifted. In the middle of a financial review, he caught his gaze drifting, not to a figure on a spreadsheet, but to the faint reflection of the winter sky on the window. That soft glimmer reminded him of the walk with Sophie, of the way she spoke without pretension, of how she described her students like tiny worlds she was learning to understand with patience and devotion. When someone asked a question about a contract clause, he returned to the moment quickly, but his voice had softened and his tone no longer carried the same sharpness. Later that day, just before leaving the office, he typed a message. "Thursday night. Dinner? I'll pick you up." The reply came minutes later, light and warm. "Only if you let me cook. You bring the wine, I'll handle the rest." He smiled and texted back, "Deal." Thursday arrived under a cloudless sky and biting cold. Ethan left work at the exact time he'd planned a rarity and stopped at a small boutique wine store in Capitol Hill. He asked for something to go with a home-cooked meal. Nothing flashy, just something comforting. The shop owner handed him 2 bottles and said, "Light but memorable. Like someone who surprises you when you least expect it." Ethan smiled, thinking it had been a long time since a wine recommendation described the woman so perfectly. When he arrived at Sophie's place, she was waiting downstairs with a grocery bag in hand. Her hair was tied up casually, and she wore a soft blue sweater and dark jeans. He thought she had never looked more beautiful. They headed up to her apartment together. While she set the table in the cozy kitchen, Ethan took in his surroundings. Books stacked in corners, children's drawings taped to the fridge, a folded blanket on the narrow couch. The apartment was small but filled with warmth. Nothing about it was designed to impress. Everything was meant to comfort. You planning to help or just stand there staring at everything? She teased from the kitchen with a quick smile. He slipped off his blazer, rolled up his sleeves, and joined her. She was slicing vegetables with surprising precision. We're having veggie curry tonight. Hope that's okay. I'm open to anything that breaks routine, he answered. She glanced up. Then you must be having the time of your life. The meal didn't take long. They ate right there in the kitchen, elbows nearly touching on the small table, as their conversation wandered far from corporate topics. She shared stories from her classroom. He talked about restoring one of his spas. Old cars. With every detail, their words found rhythm and ease. After dinner, she turned on a mellow playlist from her phone, and they moved to the couch with their wine. The space was snug but peaceful. Ethan leaned back, gazing up at the ceilings exposed. Light fixture, the rows of books, the framed family photos on the shelf. It was a world without filters, without the excess he had always known. And now, all that excess felt strangely empty. Sophie crossed her legs and rested her chin on her hand. Has your life always been this intense? Yes, and lonely. To some extent, I got used to expecting nothing from anyone. And now? She asked softly. He met her eyes. Now I'm unlearning some things. She moved closer, not seductively, not cautiously, just honestly. He slipped his arm behind her, and when she leaned her head on his shoulder, he closed his eyes for a second. They stayed that way for a while, letting the music fill the space between them, letting the night unfold without needing to define it. Eventually, she got up and returned with 2 small bowls of homemade applesauce with cinnamon. Ethan watched her move through the kitchen like she belonged to that space. When she sat beside him again, she was closer than before. They shared the wine that remained and took slow bites from the same bowl. When she set it down, Ethan reached for her hand and held it tight. I like you, Sophie, but I'm not always good at letting go of control. She squeezed his hand back. I'm not asking you to control anything, just to be here with me. He kissed her, slowly, without rush, with a tenderness he hardly recognized in himself. Her touch, calm and sure, chased away shadows he'd carried for far too long. And that night, he didn't want to leave. Not because of desire, but because staying felt like the only thing that made sense. When he woke up the next morning, the scent of her pillow still close to his face, Ethan felt something unfamiliar. Peace. He got up, buttoned his shirt, and walked into the kitchen, where she was making coffee with the window slightly cracked. She looked over her shoulder and smiled. In that small moment, something shifted inside him. Not between them, they hadn't defined anything yet. There were no labels or promises, but something had settled in him. Being with her, sipping coffee in this place so different from his polished tower of glass, wasn't just comforting. It was intentional. And for the first time in years, Ethan was choosing something, not because it was logical or strategic, but simply because it felt right. The days following that night at Sophie's apartment no longer felt like before for Ethan. He continued arriving at Carver Holdings on time, managing operations, leading meetings, and handling contracts with his signature focus. Outwardly, little had changed, but beneath the surface, something was realigning gently, steadily. The hours that once disappeared into spreadsheets and boardrooms now seemed to stretch, as if making room for something else. He began leaving work with an unfamiliar sense of anticipation, not for a new deal or a strategy session, but for her. Sometimes it was just a brief message asking if he'd eaten. Other times, it was the familiar glimpse of her school building, still lit as he passed by. There were no demands, no questions about what they were becoming, but something steady was unfolding, and it didn't come from calendars or contracts. Sophie, on her end, saw the change in more practical ways. Ethan started appearing regularly, but never too often. Once, he brought groceries, claiming he wanted to try cooking something new. Another time, he just showed up to walk her home, only staying long enough for a few quiet minutes on her couch. He never came to the school unannounced, never tried to interfere or impress. But she found out he had donated to the school's reading initiative, anonymously, and that a box of brand new books had arrived with a return label from the Carver Family Foundation, not the company. She didn't mention it, but she noticed. These were gestures that said more than expensive gifts ever could. Ethan was learning to navigate a space where control wasn't guaranteed, and in doing so, he seemed more grounded than ever. One evening, after a particularly rough day, Sophie received a message. "If you want some company, I'm at the cafe on your corner." She dropped her bag, tied her hair into a loose knot, and went back out. Her body still carried the weight of the day, but the idea of seeing him pulled her forward. He was there, a book open on the table, a mug in his hands, and his coat draped over the back of the chair beside him. When he saw her, he closed the book and stood with a quiet smile. "You came," he said. "Tonight I needed this," she replied. They ordered hot chocolate and shared a croissant. She told him about a new student in her class who hadn't spoken to anyone yet. Ethan listened closely, then asked, "Do you think he'll open up?" She nodded slowly. "I hope so. The things that really matter usually take time, especially the ones we can't rush." That Friday, Ethan invited her to spend the weekend at a place he owned near Leavenworth. A quiet cabin he used for getaways, though it had sat unused for months. Sophie hesitated not from fear, but from respect for her own rhythm, her students, and the independence she had worked so hard to build. Still, she agreed. They drove out after work. On the way, Ethan told her about how he used to go there as a teenager with his grandfather, learning about discipline and balance before he even understood the words. When they arrived, he opened the shutters, letting sunlight flood the wooden floors. Sophie glanced around and said, "It's beautiful, but it feels like a place you visit, not where you live." He looked at her and replied, "That's what I want to change." Saturday unfolded slowly, reading in the backyard, walking forest trails nearby, cooking simple meals together. That evening, they sat in front of the fireplace with a bottle of light wine and talked for hours. She told him about leaving her small hometown to attend college, how she nearly gave up when her scholarship payments were delayed. She shared her dream of pursuing a master's degree in children's literature, though she hadn't figured out how to fit that into her life yet. Ethan opened up about a new company initiative aimed at supporting technical education for teens in underprivileged communities. It wasn't a polished pitch. It was a real conversation, full of pauses, questions, and genuine listening. When she stood to grab a blanket, he watched her and thought about how different the house felt with her in it. Not styled differently, just alive, for once. On Sunday morning, she found him out on the porch with a cup of coffee and an open notebook on his lap. He was jotting down phrases, seemingly trying to connect thoughts. "Are you writing?" she asked. "Thinking," he replied. She sat beside him and glanced at the page. A mix of loose words, names of books, author quotes that didn't align with the businessman she thought she knew. "Since when do you read Dr. Seuss and Shel Silverstein?" Since you talked about wisdom in children's books, I started looking for other ways to understand things. She picked up his coffee, took a sip, and said, "Then I guess we really are learning together." In that moment, Ethan understood, without announcements, without labels, that this weekend wasn't a break from real life. It was part of what his life was becoming. And though they hadn't defined anything yet, he already knew. He wanted to keep coming back to places like this. And more importantly, to her. The invitation came on an ordinary afternoon, just as Sophie was leaving school with her arms full of reports and her mind racing through unfinished checklists. Her brother had decided to get married. Their parents wanted her to come home for the weekend to meet the future sister-in-law, attend a casual lunch with the in-laws, and help coordinate a few of the early wedding details. The date was still months away, but both families had jumped ahead with the planning. Sophie thought. It all felt a bit rushed, but didn't voice her opinion. Later that evening, when she told Ethan about the upcoming trip, he listened with genuine interest, holding a mug of coffee as she spoke. "It'll be good for you to see everyone," he offered calmly. She sighed, not because of the visit itself, but because of the logistics. When she mentioned that her parents would probably ask about him, Ethan simply said, without looking up, "Tell them you're seeing someone, that there's someone waiting for you in Seattle." She smiled, surprised by the quiet relief those words brought her. "Then I'll tell them that," she replied. No long conversation followed, just a shared understanding, unspoken but solid. She would take the Friday train. The trip was short and peaceful, and the welcome at her parents' home in Walla Walla was warm. Her brother's fiancé was kind, detail-oriented, and spoke with a calmness that put everyone at ease. Sophie and the soon-to-be bride ended up talking for hours on the porch while her mom arranged flowers for Sunday's lunch. Sophie didn't say much about Ethan, but what she did share was enough to make her feelings unmistakable. Her mother, ever watchful in the background, seemed to absorb each sentence as if fitting a puzzle together about her daughter's love. Life. At dinner on Saturday, a few aunts exchanged knowing glances. One uncle made a playful comment, and her brother, who'd always assumed no one would ever get close enough to truly win over Sophie, simply said, "I want to meet this guy." She laughed and said everyone would meet him soon enough. Later that night, lying in her childhood bedroom with the same lamp and white walls from years ago, she felt a sharp pang of missing Ethan. She texted him just one line, without adjectives or emojis. "I thought about you today." His reply came instantly, "I already miss you." Back in Seattle, Ethan was preparing for a critical investors event, a presentation to new international partners that could influence the next phase of expansion at Carver Holdings. His staff had everything ready, soup pressed, numbers rehearsed, logistics finalized. But his attention broke when he got word that Christina would be in attendance. It wasn't entirely unexpected. Though she no longer had a title or formal role, Christina had a way of showing up to these events, still moving through the room with an air of legacy and influence. The venue buzzed with familiar faces and conversations in multiple languages. Ethan delivered his speech with poise and precision. Afterward, as he made his way toward the bar for a breather, Christina appeared. "I heard you're seeing a teacher now." "That's unusual, Ethan." He didn't respond. "Quite the shift from what you used to prefer. Have you gotten bored yet, or still pretending she's the opposite of me?" He set his drink down, voice calm but unmistakably firm. "She's not the opposite of anyone. She's herself. And I'm with her because I love her." The words hung in the air, clean and definitive. Christina didn't argue. She just smiled, as if she didn't believe him, and walked away. Ethan didn't move for several seconds, staring at the spot she'd just occupied. The sentence had escaped his lips so naturally that it startled him. He hadn't planned to say it, but in that moment, he knew it was true. On Sunday afternoon, Sophie returned to Seattle by train. Ethan met her at the station. She walked toward him with a small duffel bag, a book tucked under one arm, and her hair tied up casually. He reached for her bag without a word, and she let him take it. "How was it?" he asked as they stepped outside. "Busy, but good," she answered. They drove to her apartment in a comfortable silence. Somewhere along the route, she mentioned that her parents were happy to hear she was in a relationship and had asked when they could meet him. "Soon," he said, simply. Once home, she made tea while he fluffed the pillows on her worn-out couch. When he asked if she wanted to put on a movie, she shook her head. "Let's just talk." They moved to the balcony, barefoot, tea mugs warming their hands. She shared stories from her childhood, on her grandmother's stories, grade school, annex and small-town oddities. Ethan didn't interrupt. He listened like it mattered. When she finally paused, he leaned slightly closer and said, "You make it sound like life always had meaning. I spent mine trying to build that meaning from scratch." She didn't try to respond. She just rested her head on his shoulder and stayed there. That night, they fell asleep in her narrow bed, limbs tangled. The window cracked open to let in the soft air of spring. There were no confessions, no defined plans. But Sophie, lying next to him, felt something shift. Ethan felt it too. It was as if everything they had both been balancing found a still point for a few precious hours. The next day, they returned to their respective routines, but their text exchanges carried a rhythm that needed no excuse. He didn't know yet when he would say the words again, the ones he had spoken to Christina, but he knew he would. Not in a rush, not out of pressure, because the woman now wrapped in his blanket was the only thing that made sense. And he didn't want a life that didn't include her. The invitation had been stuck to the fridge for weeks. Heavy cardstock, embossed lettering, an elegant date marked well in advance, and her name written in careful penmanship, Sophie Garner and guest. Her parents had already asked if she planned to attend, and she had said yes. But now they were pressing for a confirmed answer about the guest. "Are you still seeing that businessman?" Her mother had asked over the phone, not judgmental, just genuinely curious. "Yes, and if he's free, he's coming with me." It wasn't a complicated decision, but it did require coordination. That evening, while they prepped dinner together in her kitchen, Sophie brought it up. Ethan was slicing tomatoes, focused on the blade and his fingers. "My parents want to know if you're coming to my brother's wedding." He paused for a second. "Do we have a date?" She pointed toward the fridge. "It's been up there for weeks." He walked over, glanced at the invite, washed his hands, and said, "We're going. It's officially on my calendar." After that, the days took on a new rhythm. Ethan began leaving a few personal things at Sophie's apartment: a book on her nightstand, a folded shirt in the closet, eventually his entire toiletry kit. She didn't comment, she just cleared a spot. At his place, he reorganized a shelf to hold her clothes. There was no discussion, just action. Their routines had merged so naturally that it felt like they were already sharing a life, not just time. They split errands, dinner duty, and even calendar alerts. There weren't dramatic declarations or constant reminders, but everything felt solid. One night, after a particularly exhausting day for both of them, Sophie came home to a warm container of homemade soup waiting on the kitchen table. There was a note next to it, scrawled in Ethan's handwriting. "Thought about you all day. This might help." The following week, Ethan turned down 2 business trips, one to speak at a tech summit in Chicago, the other for a panel in Vancouver. "Personal commitment," he replied to both invitations via email. His assistant asked if she should log the trip with Sophie into the firm's internal schedule. He shook his head. "No need. It's not for work, it's for us." The night before their departure, Sophie noticed a sealed envelope on the dining table. Inside were 2 train tickets, first class, printed with their names. "I figured it's a long ride," he said casually. "Might as well be comfortable and arrive relaxed." The journey itself was quiet, unhurried. They didn't talk much. Sophie leaned her head on his shoulder and drifted into sleep, and Ethan didn't move a muscle the entire way. When they arrived at her parents' house in Walla Walla, they were greeted with hugs, warm smiles, and a few curious glances. Ethan was respectful, understated, but never distant. Her brother, much like Sophie, was direct and observant. They connected quickly, almost silently. The future sister-in-law, more outgoing, asked how they met. "My friend Julia introduced." "Yes," Sophie said, keeping it light. "And did it work?" The woman teased with a grin. "Still working," Sophie answered, smiling with calm assurance. When they returned to Seattle, they kept things simple. Dinner at home, fresh pasta, a bottle of red wine, and the two of them talking about family dynamics and old memories from the weekend. Later, while Sophie rinsed dishes and Ethan dried the glasses, he paused beside the kitchen counter. He reached into the pocket of his blazer, which he had left hanging on the back of the chair, and pulled out a small, dark box. He turned toward her and held it out, no preamble, no rehearsed lines. "I don't have a speech," he said quietly. "I just have this certainty. Will you marry me?" Sophie looked at him for a few seconds, her heart pounding but her voice steady, rising from a place that felt grounded. Double quotes. "Yes, I will." He slipped the ring onto her finger with a tenderness that said everything he didn't. They didn't say anything else right then. They didn't need to. They just held each other and kissed. The months that followed unfolded with a kind of ease neither Ethan nor Sophie had really known before. Their weekends gradually turned into little getaways, sometimes to a friend's cabin near the Olympic Peninsula, other times just day trips to coastal towns a couple of hours away. They'd share the drive, switch off the music, and let the quiet moments stretch without discomfort. There wasn't a rush anymore, no pressure to impress or define anything. There was just a rhythm of living side by side. Sophie continued teaching at the local high school, and Ethan restructured parts of his demanding schedule to create room for her. They started having lunch together at least twice a week, and dinners happened even on the days when one of them was tired or lost in thought. Somehow, in that simple routine, they grew. No grand gestures, no performances, just presence. Eventually, word of their engagement began to spread naturally among close friends and family. There was no announcement, no social media post. If someone asked, they'd simply answer, "Yes, we're getting married." And most people responded with a smile and something like, "About time." Sophie's parents invited the two of them for a quiet Sunday lunch. Not the whole family this time, just the couple. The conversation was soft, flowing around old photographs laid out on the table and childhood memories. Her mother said she had never seen Sophie this grounded. Her father, after listening to Ethan for a while, remarked that he spoke like someone who made decisions with a clear mind. Number 1 brought up party plans. Not them, not the parents. What truly mattered had already been decided. Everything else would unfold at its own pace. The wedding took place a few months later, on a warm spring afternoon under a clear blue sky. They chose a quiet spot just outside Seattle, surrounded by trees and wildflowers. There were no rows of decorations, no over-the-top displays, just the people who mattered and the peace of being where they belonged. Sophie wore a soft, flowing dress and had her hair tied back in the way she liked. Ethan showed up in a crisp white shirt and an easy, unforced smile. Their vows weren't long, but they carried the weight of everything they had lived through. Together, they promised honesty, consistency, and care, exactly the foundation the relationship had always been built on. When they kissed, it didn't feel ceremonial. It felt like part of a conversation they'd been having all along. wasn't the beginning of something new. It was simply the continuation of everything that had already been love. The end. So, what did you think of this story? Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel to keep enjoying stories like this one. See you next time.